Sabrina 2000s comic issue 19. The story starts out with Sabrina being excited, so that means her smiling family is going to make her miserable, right? She's excited for the foreign exchange student to arrive. I've never seen a high schooler excited for that. No one's mad about it, but it just seems to be seen as normal. I guess she's hoping he'll look nice. Quigley tips over because they're just having a frozen dinner, and Rotunda the Troll's the one who froze them. She's Rotunda? I was expecting it to be Enchantra's rival. She says that she wanted to make her suffer. What took her so long? This would have happened this story after summer camp. And then it'd look like a story arc. But at least this way I appreciate the continuity nod more because it's more unexpected. I have a question. Why doesn't Sabrina freeze her in time with a single point and then effortlessly return her family to normal? Or at the very least, since we know she can summon things, why doesn't she summon something around her to trap her, like a force field bubble? Instead, she's dumb enough to think she can talk Rotunda into undoing the spell, but if she was really intimidating, she'd just torture Sabrina with magic, or at least freeze her in time. Would Sabrina act like this with an armed mugger too? She was given advance warning. She could point at her to change her mind. Instead, she makes her family disappear, which I'm already enjoying, and she gets grabbed by a monster from behind who's holding her arms easily. Can't Sabrina kick Sallysaurus by moving her leg back? So this monster is one of Rotunda's fellow inmates from the other realm juvenile detention center for girls. There'd be more than one. Rotunda should have explained that she had her spell locked so that it was so enchanted that only she could undo it. Like the magic from her would stick around as a guard to fight back against other magic. Rotunda says that the other girls in Juvie are teaching her some cool tricks, like shapeshifting, which is what the guards will think she's doing when they'll see Sabrina. Why did the girls in Juvie still have their magical powers? That never happened! This sitcom made more sense. Why does Sabrina ask what she's saying when it's obvious and she's being given all the time in the world to use magic to save herself? This is like if she caused a zombie apocalypse by accident, somehow, and then didn't undo it with a single point afterwards. Rotunda says she's gonna pass herself off as a foreign exchange student. But logically, she'd better change the way she looks, or she'll make it obvious what she really is right away. There's no reason she'd send Sallysaurus back to Juvie, especially since she says sorry about it. It is the responsible thing to do, but she wouldn't care about that. Why doesn't Sabrina's family warp out of the crystal prison? I have to assume it's enchanted so they can't, just like the version of Anarchisonic with Archimedes in it. And this explains why Hilda's pointing at it does nothing. I also have to assume that they're not able to use any magic at all, so they're not able to reverse time and undo this. Yeah, Sabrina could also reverse time to undo all of this. It sure is nice of Rotunda to not murder them all immediately. She could throw the crystal prison right here. She'd be more intimidating if she injured them, and we found out why she's in Juvie. This is the problem with having an omnipotent villain who doesn't establish herself to clearly have limits, moral or otherwise. After Sabrina is tormented tediously, Rotunda brainwashes the principal into thinking that he doesn't need to see the paperwork, and Sabrina and her aunts are home with the flu, and she's the new student. So does she use magic to get rid of the real foreign exchange student? Jem calls her a toad. I love that. Jem's already a much better character when her snark is directed at someone who deserves it instead of her insulting Sabrina for no reason. And some bullies want Rotunda's lunch money, as I wonder why she didn't get a more appealing looking shapeshifted appearance. And I wonder why Sabrina was assumed to be Rotunda by the random prisoners, when she could have been anybody. Granted, Rotunda is missing. Wasn't it obvious to the artist that we wanted to see Rotunda beat up those bullies? What the fuck was he thinking? And because she beat Slugloaf up, he says he's in love. I hope that's because of a concussion and not because he's doomed to be in an abusive relationship later where he's the victim. Then Jem's terrified when, for no reason, Rotunda assumes that she's a big shot and demands her to be her friend. It makes no sense that she thinks she's a big shot, when she doesn't know her at all. But if she's really lonely, it makes sense that she'd want a friend. Jem asks where Sabrina is, already missing her because she prefers her. Sabrina's being threatened by some bullies, but she's still able to fly on a broom to try to avoid them. Why doesn't Sabrina freeze these bullies in time, or make them good? I guess the people who put the witches in prison thought it would be immoral to brainwash all the criminals to be good. Instead, Sally Soares gets run into and breaks her broom, but she's sniffing, implying that she wants to betray Rotunda for betraying her. I assume that the prison has an anti-teleportation spell in the whole thing, which is the only explanation for why everyone doesn't warp out of there. So Sabrina can't warp out, but can't she turn herself invisible? Is there any spell that can? No, because shapeshifting is still possible, which means that Rotunda was probably able to shapeshift into a guard to escape. Then why doesn't every criminal do that? Why doesn't Sabrina do that? Why is it still possible? Even Flynn didn't write that. At least the prison is all one gender and for minors only, which is more realistic than the Zone prison where it wasn't. In the comedy page, Hilda keeps slamming the cabinet doors because Quigley makes her so angry. Hilda says that Quigley knew when they were eating, but doesn't call, and he's late to dinner. And she wants him to say sorry or thank you or please. He lectures about magic being evil, but he won't even say stuff like this. Then the story ends with her zapping his food to burn it to a crisp. Good! Why isn't he the most abused character and not Salem? Why doesn't he move out to avoid this? After it's explained that Sally Soares was just in solitary, she says in very forced, stilted dialogue, "Me feel bad for you," instead of saying I. That would have been beaten out of her, or not as bad, a long time ago. Why is she speaking like a stupid idiot? I guess she's bad English in particular. She says that she'll protect Sabrina because she feels bad for her just because Rotunda double-crossed her. She tells Sabrina that she'll show her where Rotunda learned the magic she used at her house. She wouldn't have to show her this. Sabrina would know how to do that herself. She thanks her and is told to send Rotunda back to her to repay her, as opposed to free Sally Soares. It was tedious to see Sabrina's family complaining about Rotunda, nagging her for drinking out of the cart and not using a napkin. So I didn't feel like staring at the panel long enough to immediately see that it was Salem who said he hopes she wouldn't eat the cookies, and see that he said, eh? Right? Eventually this gets the rest of them to use reverse psychology on Rotunda, tricking her to trying to get the cookie jar open. Oh good, Spooky isn't here to do Sabrina's work instead of her. The note just says that he'll return later. Oh never mind. I had faith in the writing to let Sabrina be competent. Instead of her getting revenge on Rotunda herself, Spooky says that he wanted to enjoy a more subtle arrival for once and try to solve this one without throwing a punch. Huh? Sabrina's given a magic book, which inaccurately calls teleportation black magic, which is not a mistake that anyone would make. She doesn't want to send Rotunda to her just to prolong the cycle of violence. This irritates her, and Sabrina miraculously doesn't get betrayed by her for saying that she won't send Rotunda back just to have her get beaten up. I guess Sally Soares is just manipulating her and lying when she says that she respects her principles and promises not to beat her up. Why did the writer think he needed an anti-violence message in a comic aimed at girls? Why did Sabrina need to say a long chant to warp home? All someone would have to do to warp is imagine themselves somewhere else. So she'd obviously have done this immediately after getting to the prison. Or she'd have pixie powder with her. Why did she gasp when Zelda said that she thinks Rotunda's had enough from Hilda while she's crying? She shouldn't be saving her. Salem's torturing Rotunda by showing her Sabrina's old baby shows on tape. That's the only torture these ants would carry out. Even though it'd torture them too because they'd have to watch it. Why is Rotunda just sitting there without being tied to the chair? And why isn't she fighting back with magic? I guess she knows they'd fight back with magic. Why doesn't she freeze them in time again with a single point? Was she depowered? She says she'll tell them everything, even though she could just proceed to lie. Sabrina warps her back to prison, and the writing completely lacks all self-awareness as Zelda says that's very advanced conjuring. It won't be hard to imagine someone being teleported somewhere. I also don't buy that she has to do this with her arms instead of simply pointing. I guess she's just being fancy about it to show off. It was nice of her to tell her aunts she loves them. Isn't it unrealistic that at no point does a witch in these comics stutter or say a word wrong when trying to say a whole spell? She doesn't say in any of her spells. I have a hard time saying sentences in my script without saying words wrong sometimes, and Sabrina's supposed to be a novice witch. Not to mention it's really convenient that witches in the comic always remember exactly what all the words in their complicated spell are. It'd be so much easier for her to just warp her home without also having to concentrate on saying a rhyming spell. The story ends with the real foreign exchange student giving the kids a presentation about her family harvesting turnips, which bores them. And the bullies like Rotunda better. Slugloaf wants her address and he wrote her a letter. Is this seriously such a rare thing? The school having foreign exchange students? That it results in an entire assembly dedicated to her? That never happened at my school. We had dozens of them and it was no big deal to anybody. I wonder if the writer has ever had a foreign exchange student at his school. Maybe he knew this was unrealistic and it was just a joke, but it's not a good joke. She's boring because she's ugly and knows multiple kinds of turnips. And the bully wants to be abused in an abusive relationship. Switch the genders on this for a second. I wish we saw Sabrina send Rotunda that letter at least, because this seems to be creating a plot thread. And it'd be wrapped up if we saw her reaction. In the next story, Salem's making a fool out of himself, beating some drums like a beatnik. I think he did these kinds of things in the sitcom too, and it made me worried about his well-being. Anyone would go a little crazy in a situation. He's so desperate to have fun after so long of being a cat that he'll try anything. He complains that the man is being uncool while he's holding a legal document, and it says that his appeal of conviction of fischicide is denied, which was dragged on for centuries. And Salem calls the salmon he killed uppity. Wasn't he not a cat centuries ago? I'm confused because the sitcom Salem said he was sentenced to 100 years as a cat, and that's all. Salem's told that since he was found guilty of eating the Druid King's beloved fish, he's sentenced to turn into a catfish and swim around in the water as soon as Sabrina's done reading. How did he meet the Druid King? Why would the punishment only happen after someone was finished reading the document? If Sabrina hadn't come in and instead minded her own business, he would have never had to deal with this problem. He didn't even plan on reading it. He just wanted to appeal it again. If Salem was smart, he would have zapped up a copy of the Druid King's fish to eat, so there'd be no consequences to eating it. I still want to know what a druid is in the context of Sabrina's universe, because it keeps being referenced in the context of witches. Salem complains that he doesn't even have his magical powers. Trying to take over the world doesn't get your powers taken from you, but eating a pet fish does. The story would have had me scared, but I know Salem's guaranteed to be fine. I think I have the story. He notices that the water is warm and wants a clue to where he is, and has to avoid an alligator, which miraculously gives up on eating him for no reason and keeps swimming away. And why is the manatee able to talk? Why doesn't he tell Salem what he used to be? I assume he's a transformed warlock too. Salem then turns out to recognize propeller scars on sight, and also knows that manatees are endangered, because I guess when you're a bored cat, you'll go research anything, even if it has nothing to do with your life. This just comes off as the writer really wanting to educate the audience about this, but it's just jarring. A comic that refuses to show Rotunda beat up a bully shows this. Salem's told to fake left and go right and gets caught in a fish net as I wonder if part of his punishment is that he's immune to being teleported. Since Sabrina should have told her aunts to warp him home. Why does Sabrina think she needs to say a very specific spell to warp Rotunda back to prison? And so she wouldn't know the spell to say to save Salem. It'd be easy to imagine him coming home. Why would Salem sing when he thinks he's about to get eaten? Every time he's written to act comical and silly when he's in danger. It's forced as hell. Speaking of that, he quotes Shakespeare for no reason. Sabrina saves him with a net in a rented canoe. Hilda says that Sabrina told her what happened and she used her powers to track him here. The story ends with Salem being in an aquarium in Sabrina's house. In the next story, Jem asks a clown to squirt her despite being told to sit down. And for absolutely no reason, the clown somehow hits Sabrina instead of Jem and thinks he didn't miss. And this was all part of her plan and she makes a joke. This is a bad start so far. If the series wants to teach kids that acting like Jem has bad consequences, why does Jem ever get off scot-free? This doesn't make any sense, and keeping it inconsistent just makes it look like the real lesson is only Sabrina can't get away with nothing. A woman says they should buy refreshments during the intermission, as I wonder why a bunch of teenagers or preteens were taken to a clown act in school. The Sabrina I know would at least use magic to make Jem trip after that. There's no reason she can't be written to punish her for misbehaving. The audience would enjoy it. She says that while she would leave from embarrassment, she doesn't want to miss Gus Gutsy's daredevil act because of the way he looks. Sabrina wants to make Jem disappear during Gus's act. Chloe acts like that's a bad thing. Well, so much for her purpose in the comic. And the writer should have known that we don't need yet another person lecturing Sabrina on magic use. Now I'm wishing she wasn't in the story. Although it is morally responsible and good of Chloe, of course. But it doesn't mean I like it, because I have no reason to sympathize with Jem at all. Because bullshit, I'm somehow expected to believe that Sabrina made Gus vanish instead of Jem, when obviously she would have imagined Jem vanishing for an hour. It won't be a matter of hoping a beam would hit her. Why does she have to worry about aiming accurately? If magic can teleport, it would obviously just teleport right to where it's wanted to go. And there's no reason at all that a witch wouldn't be able to immediately undo her spell, bring Gus back, and then do her spell correctly. Sabrina doesn't need to be punished for trying to give Jem what she deserves. She wasn't punished in the 90s comic for giving Amy what she deserves. This story sucks. Sabrina somehow thinks that she has to disguise herself as Gus and humiliate herself slipping and falling, and uses her magic to save herself in the bike, and thankfully gets a drink spilled on Jem's head. Couldn't Sabrina have created a magical duplicate of Gus to replace him? The story ends with Gus taking credit for the clearly magical stunt that should have logically had people calling him a demon, or at least had scientists begging to see his flying bike and mass produce it. Jem could have been made to get a drink spilled on her head at the start of the story. Having it be an accident on Sabrina's part isn't as satisfying as her punishing her. The first story, by Mike Gallagher, is complete nonsense because Sabrina should have just frozen Rotunda in time right away, or at least summoned stuff to trap her. Spooky gets them out anyways, so the plot would have been shorter and made sense if Sabrina just magically dealt with Rotunda in one point, having no reason to listen to her ranting. She didn't even need Spooky. She didn't need to learn more magic that was intuitive anyways. The 70s show got it right. She'd know how to teleport herself from day one. Why would she be able to warp herself out of a prison for witches? At that point, how is anyone still in there? This plot was ridiculous. Any kind of satisfaction it could have given us was robbed from us because we didn't get to see Rotunda beat up that bully or get attacked herself. I don't care that she's a girl, she's still an awful character. How many times in this comic will Sabrina be made a damsel in distress when she should be able to save herself? It's just melodramatic. She's worse than Princess Peach because she's omnipotent. There's no reason at all that the prisoners would have still had their powers and broken out. The sitcom made more sense. When Sabrina got replaced by her evil twin, Sabrina tried to warp herself out right away and she couldn't. In the sitcom, Sabrina can depower herself and put her magic in a jar. We saw that witches in this comic could remove all of the residual magic from a house. Is this like the Avatar universe where removing someone's superfluous magical powers is considered as horrible as mutilating them because the magic is part of their being? That's not based on logic. Bad guys shouldn't keep their powers. That's common sense. This kind of story where Sabrina is replaced with a prisoner was already done in the sitcom anyways, and it didn't make sense there either. How would Katrina have sent Sabrina a computer virus riddled email from a prison on another planet that when answered would replace her with her, when Katrina's trapped in a prison for witches and can't warp herself out? She can enchant an email but not warp? But at least in that story we saw a few interesting concepts like an evil, cheerful version of Zelda with a southern accent who caused the plague. Rotunda's life in Sabrina's high school had nothing to do with Sabrina's life and was just filler. The second story, by Mike Gallagher, is about Salem getting turned into a catfish in the ocean for eating a king's fish, which he somehow met because Sabrina finished reading a legal document on him. Why would the punishment have taken hundreds of years to happen? And it sure was generous of that punishment to end after he swam only a mile instead of being permanent, when it was already cruel enough to take away his powers. He got warped to a water body and miraculously avoided being eaten by an alligator. He wouldn't have survived that. And I have to just assume that part of the spell made it impossible to just teleport him home, though nobody knew what he looked like when he was a catfish until they saw him again. So no wonder he couldn't be teleported back to them. But that should have been explained. The final story is about Sabrina's attempt to make Gem disappear for an hour, somehow failing because her magic came out in a beam that somehow missed when Gem dropped her pen. And it hit Gus, and somehow that made him disappear for an hour when she wouldn't have been picturing him disappearing. It wouldn't have done anything to him because the magic would know he wasn't Gem. And there's no reason Sabrina wouldn't have been able to undo her spell right away and try it properly. Why is Chloe still friends with Sabrina if she's like this? Why would she need to pretend she's Gus? Wouldn't she make herself look like Gus while doing that? There's no intelligent forethought that would lead Sabrina to anticipate that her spells will backfire on her sometimes. She had no way of knowing Gem would bend down.